In 587 BCE, the Emperor Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed the city of Jerusalem, razing the Temple of Solomon to the ground. The house of David and all her heirs, the temple priests and officials, would all be taken into exile. None of that first generation, which was taken away to Babylon, would ever return to see Jerusalem again. But the power of Babylon did not last forever. 50 years later, the Empire of Persia stomped all over Babylon, and the new emperor, Cyrus the Great of Persia, issued a decree to gain favor with his new subjects, allowing all exilees to return home. The priests would be allowed to rebuild their temple. After decades in darkness, the light was dawning at last, but the community of exiles that would return to Jerusalem was not the same group that had left. No one knows for sure what happened, but all record of the house of David ended during the exile. The priests would return, a new temple would rise, but the palace and the monarchy would both remain in ruins. For those members of the court and the temple preparing to return home, the exile had changed everything. They had lived for centuries with temple rites and the oral culture of the people undergirding their way of life, and those things were now missing. They were living in a culture which spoke a different language and worshipped a different god. To keep from being completely assimilated into Babylonian culture, they would be forced to find new ways of preserving their religion. This meant that text, which is an excellent tool for preserving history, became more important to them than ever, and preservation was definitely the order of the day. The texts written after the exile show a new concern for the purity of the people of Israel. In the 10th chapter of Ezra, it relates a story about how the exiles forced the men of Judah and Benjamin to send away their foreign wives. Nothing is said about where these women are sent to or what may have happened to any children born of these marriages, but it does demonstrate how serious they were, if cruelly misguided, about purifying themselves from foreign influence. Cyrus the Great holds the distinction of being the only non-Jew in the entire Bible to be referred to with the title Messiah. You'd be hard-pressed, in fact, to find anyone in the Bible who receives more glowing praise. In Isaiah, God says of him, "He is my shepherd, and he shall enact all my will." Later on in Isaiah, it even says, "It's too light a thing that you should only raise up the tribes of Judah and restore the survivors of Israel. I will make you a light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." Messiah, shepherd, light to the nations, liberator of captives, bringer of salvation. Sound familiar? Many of the oracles which Christians have normally interpreted as referring to Jesus in their original intended meaning referred to Cyrus. The language which the exiles used to celebrate the emperor who had set them free from captivity became the language of hope for future generations as well. Beloved though Cyrus may have been, he was still a Gentile. Though much of the devotion which would have once been going to the house of David prior to the exile was now going to Cyrus and his eventual successor Darius, the Judean people still required a central institution to build their identity up, and that institution was the temple. When temple rebuilding efforts began, the hopes were very high. The prophet Haggai said that the new temple would be far bigger than the last, and that God would shower it with treasure. More important than its size or its wealth, though, was its centrality to the life of the Judean people. During this period, Jewish practice and devotion became singularly focused on the temple, so much so that we call it the Second Temple period. Our society is very compartmentalized, so it may be difficult for us to understand how important the temple institution was to them. In our culture, religious buildings serve only religious functions, but the temple was part of every aspect of their society. The temple was where you would go to have disputes resolved. It was the highest court available to you. It was also where you would go to conduct all of your business. The temple was the largest market, a currency exchange, and a bank, all rolled into one. The temple was integrated into every aspect of their lives. This Second Temple period began in the year 530 BCE and continued until the year 70 CE, in which the Jewish people would once again be forced to watch their temple burned to the ground, this time at the hands of the Roman legions. All of these themes of the return from exile form a potent combination. A people striving to retain their culture and to purify themselves of foreign influence, the rise of messianic hopes in an unlikely figure, the supreme importance of the temple. Together, these things led to the rise of eschatological thinking. Eschatology means the study of end things, like death, or what happens after death, or what are God's plans for the future. They began to see in the temple something beyond just a place to perform sacrifices and a host for God's name. They began to see a symbol of their idealized society. Starting in the 40th chapter, the prophet Ezekiel gives a highly detailed description of a vision of a new temple in Jerusalem, which lasts for 5 chapters. The temple itself that he describes would be as large as the entire old city of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount would have to grow by many times to accommodate such a temple. It's no accident, though, that in Ezekiel's vision, the temple would replace the entire city. In many ways, this is what the exilees had been imagining. An entire city, an entire people, dedicated to God, like priests, righteous, pure, having been chastened by exile. The old city of Jerusalem burned to the ground because of her idolatry. The new city would be different. It would almost be as if the new city had descended from heaven. The religion of the people of Judea flourished during the Second Temple period, and with its new emphasis on texts to preserve their identity, this strange book of books really began to take shape.